Hello and good morning. It's 11 o'clock on the 2nd of February. My name is Jonathan Greenstein, and welcome to today's webinar on operational resilience, the expectations of firms and practical steps you should be taking, hosted and presented by Thistle Initiatives. With the first policy milestone now having passed on the 31st of March 22, the FCA expects firms that fall in scope to be currently undertaking mapping and testing exercises to ensure that by no later than March 25, they remain within impact tolerances for each important business service. So firms should be using the time between now and then to prepare. Now, from what we've seen in our work with firms, this is no easy task, and often firms have been finding it more difficult than anticipated. So what are we going to do today? During this webinar, we will explore the roadmap to comply with the new operational resilience requirements. Additionally, we'll discuss the FCA's expectations, where you should be in terms of the timeline for compliance, and we will discuss some practical steps to help get you there. Before we start in earnest, let me give you some context and background. Now, I think it's fair to say that the disruption caused by the pandemic and the challenging environments that firms now operate in, including post-Brexit and now the crisis in Ukraine, demonstrates why it's critically important for firms to invest in operational resilience to protect themselves, their customers, and the financial system from the impact of any disruptions. During the pandemic, thankfully, most firms were able to maintain continuity of service despite the significant stress this caused. And overall, we witnessed a good degree of resilience, with certain operational arrangements and working practices changing more permanently as a result, such as hybrid working. However, it highlighted the need for the regulators to ensure that a more robust regulatory framework was in place, which they've decided to do by ensuring firms embed operational resilience into their businesses by March 2025. Today's presentation will be delivered by Lorraine Moat, our Head of Payment Services at Thistle Initiatives. To briefly introduce Thistle Initiatives, we are a specialist governance, risk and compliance consultancy that has been supporting firms in the financial services industry for 10 years now. Our team of expert compliance consultants guide firms through the FCA authorization process, provide ongoing advice and support to the full breadth of the regulated financial services industry, and help firms with the implementation of new and changing regulations. Now, before we begin properly, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping points. Either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you have it configured, you'll see a button called Q&A. If you have any questions, please can you ask them there. We'll try to get through as many of these questions at the end of today's discussion. Now, you'll also notice a button called Chat. If you can, please do not post questions in the chat function, as this will not be monitored. Now, with this in mind, we've got a poll question, which I'd like to ask of our audience here today. And let me just launch it very quickly. So you should see it come up on your screens. I'll read it out, the question. I'll read the question out. Have you started with your operational resilience mapping and testing exercise? Now, you've got three answers: yes, no, and not applicable. Let's give our attendees a few moments, maybe up to 15, 20 seconds to get a response in, and then I will share the results. So bear with us 2 seconds. Give it another second here. All right, let's end the poll now and share the results. Hope everyone can see these here now. So a lot of the people here today, most people who this is relevant for, have said, yeah, they have started, but quite a good percentage said they haven't. Lorraine, have you got anything to comment on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think these figures are quite interesting, but not surprising in my view. I think that it's good to see that a proportion of people have started their journey in terms of mapping their operational resilience, but equally, I'm not surprised to see that there are a number of people who haven't yet started. And my message to them would be, not to panic. I think what we're about to discuss in today's webinar for sure will be helpful. And there's definitely still things you can do to sort of play catch up and make sure that you're well on your way ahead of the 2025 deadline. So.
Thanks, Lorraine. And thank you to everyone who responded in the poll. Now, with those responses in mind, I would like to invite Lorraine to start our discussion today. Lorraine, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview, first of all, Jonathan, and for the introduction. And a very warm welcome to everyone from me. Firstly, I think the important thing to understand from all of this really is what is it the FCA is seeking to achieve by introducing operational resilience requirements for those in-scope firms. Now, the FCA have said that they assume operational failures are inevitable. They're going to happen no matter what. But as we don't know what's going to happen and when it will happen, the FCA are looking for firms to plan for a whole range of possibilities. And the objective of that really is to then give them the opportunity to improve on their operational resilience with the objective of protecting consumers, the wider financial sector, and of course the UK economy in general from the impact of any operational disruptions. And I think Jonathan alluded to, the pandemic and other matters that are going on in the world right now. And these are the kind of things that the FCA is looking for firms to plan for. So what is an operational disruption? So in essence, it's any disruption or deviation from or interruption to normal business services or activities or operations that may therefore result in a loss of data, maybe system availability, system reliability, or control of systems, or where it may indicate some unauthorized access, for example, to your data, or any impact really on the integrity of your data. So in a nutshell, it really is about any IT disruption, maybe technology failure, data compromise, fraud. It could be something that's come to you via third party, so it could be as a result of a third party risk, maybe even a telecommunications failure, or something as simple as organizational change. And I think we tend to forget about those smaller areas that could still impact and cause disruption. And even going as far as to think about people in your business and where perhaps disruption could be caused as a result of the resource you have or don't have, as the case may be. Now, allow you as a firm to meet the FCA's requirements and to address the type of disruption your firm may face. There's a whole number of things that you have to consider in your roadmap to operational resilience, but what are they basically? What are the key questions that you're going to be asking yourself as a business? I'm going to be exploring each of these more fully in the following slides, so please don't worry if some of the terminology I'm about to use doesn't immediately make sense to you. But firstly, and most importantly, you're going to need to map your important business services. And we will look at what they look like in a minute. You then need to determine what impact tolerances you need to set for each of those important business services, so you can determine exactly to what extent any disruption can be managed before it then goes on to causing what the FCA talk about as intolerable harm. You're also going to need to conduct scenario testing, and that's really just going to allow you to check whether in fact the impact tolerances you've set have you set them appropriate in an appropriate level, and are they going to continue to remain appropriate as your business changes, for example. You're also going to have to conduct a formal lessons learned exercise, and this is going to be as a result of any testing that you're going to be doing. So you're going to have to test some actual operational disruption or some scenario you're going to have to play out, which will allow you then to identify what you're doing well, but also give you the ability to identify and improve and effectively respond and recover from any future operational disruptions. Like most things, communication strategy is important and is required to make sure that you've got prompt communication with external stakeholders, maybe your clients, investors, but also the consumers that are often at the end of any service you're providing. And during a disruption, this has got to be considered, and as well as managing the safety and the workplace demands of your personnel. One thing I just want to sort of note here is please remember that a lot of the building blocks you've probably already got in your business. Actually, they're probably already in place. So I'd encourage you to think about those existing processes, the risk management and control framework that you've got in place, and use them and then enhance them, for example, where you just need to do so. Most importantly, I just want to touch on the subject of culture, something that's very close to the FCA's heart, has been for a long time. So what you need to and are expected to do is create a culture of resilience. So resilience, it's not just another exercise in compliance. It needs to be a guiding principle for continuous improvement in your business. The idea is it will help you prevent, adapt, respond, and recover from any type of event. Okay, so let's look at mapping the important business services. And one of the first steps I spoke about earlier is to map these. But you first of all got to understand, well, what is an important business service? Now that's going to look different for every business, of course, because we all don't work exactly in the same way. But the FCA will define it as such. They define it as a service provided by a firm, by you, or by another person on behalf of your firm, to one or more clients of your firm, which, if there were any disruption, could cause intolerable levels of harm to any one or more of your clients, or where it could pose a risk to the soundness, stability, or resilience of the UK financial system or the market in which you operate as a whole. So IBS, as they call it, important business services, are basically those critical services that are likely to have a strong, more than anything else, a strong customer impact. So that's how you need to look at it when you're evaluating these. But what point does the requirement to map an important business service start and finish? And that's something that certainly firms I've worked with in the past really take time to understand and think about. And it's important that you think about, for example, any dependencies that may exist to deliver your important business services. You'll have to definitely think about the products and services that are complementary or maybe bundled, where operational resilience impact on one may, for example, impact on the other. Although let me quickly just say it's important that what you don't look at is a bundled set of important business services. The requirement really is to identify them and separate them, which is, as I say, quite often the hardest job, rather than looking at them as a collection of services. So like I say, things you need to consider would be the nature of your client base, and that's considering where there may be any particular vulnerabilities in that client base, the ability for your customers to obtain the service from another provider if, for example, your service becomes unavailable, the time criticality for clients receiving the service from you. Of course, the number of clients to whom you provide that service is important, the sensitivity of the type of data that you're managing, and the impact on the functioning of the UK financial system. You also need to think about your own firm's financial position and the impact it would have in that, and of course, the resulting risk of any reputational damage that there may be. And in doing so, you will need to consider how these important business services may be impacted by the people in your business, your processes, the technology you use, and the facilities you have to hand, and of course, the information required to deliver each one. I think it's important to say here what doesn't constitute an important business service, and usually this is sort of internal services, maybe some certain HR functions that you're providing, or like payroll, for example. These don't need to be considered important business services. They are certainly enablers of an important business service, but they're not in themselves an important business service. So then you've done that, you've recognised what your important business services are, and the next step on your roadmap would be to define your impact tolerance levels. Now, the impact tolerance refers to that maximum tolerable level of disruption to the important business service that can be measured by length of time or whatever is appropriate for your business, but many other relevant metrics could play their part. And that needs to reflect the point at which any further disruption to the important business service could in fact cause intolerable harm. As a business, you're going to be expected to set an impact tolerance for every important business service, and that's going to just allow you to understand the maximum amount of time for which that disruption to that service can be tolerated, or perhaps a point in time beyond which disruption just cannot be tolerated. So for example, and as I mentioned previously, you might want to just talk about and consider where disruptions to maybe multiple services could then significantly compound the impact of that disruption. So if it impacts one, is it going to therefore have a follow-on effect and impact another. So you really need to consider the impact and failure of other related services when you're setting impact tolerances for one individual important business service. There's also an expectation that you consider any fluctuation in demand for your services. Now, this is quite common in most businesses. There are times of the day, or there are times, seasonal implications, times throughout the year where you use services made for the volume and type of services you're for. So you're going to have to consider your impact tolerances in line with those fluctuations. And just a final thought here is, when you're setting these tolerance levels, there's absolutely no expectation that you're going to breach any other regulatory obligation. So you don't need to do that just because you need to remain within your impact tolerance. All your normal regulatory obligations still stand. You set your impact tolerances now, and then you're saying, okay, we're good to go, but we need to check that these impact tolerances are effective. So what we do is we undertake scenario testing. Excuse me. Now, scenario testing is in essence a hypothetical, severe, but plausible event. And this is going to give your firm the ability to gain sort of a comprehensive understanding of the resilience of your important business services. It's going to help you identify any vulnerabilities, any areas that might require remediation. And it should also help you determine whether, in fact, your response playbook is fit for purpose. Your scenario testing should assume that the disruption has occurred, of course, and this should include things like data integrity scenarios and incorporate third-party disruption. And I will be speaking about third parties separately as part of this webinar today, and along with any other factors that would be considered beyond your firm's control. The important thing and the expectation is that your scenarios need to be varied. They need to be challenging, so you can't make them easy for yourself. That's unfortunately not going to wash. But you need to just overall ask yourself, what might happen if things in our business don't go as planned, and what kind of things could possibly happen? These scenarios will include cases, like I mentioned just a minute ago, where multiple parts of the organisation are disrupted simultaneously. And given that impact tolerances are set at that maximum level of disruption a firm can tolerate, your firm's going to have to judge for yourselves, based on your own risk appetite, just how close to that line you're comfortable to be. And you'll be able to understand that better through this ongoing testing. Now, the form of testing a firm will use has to be robust, it has to be appropriate, and it is very unlikely that just using desktop testing alone is going to be suffice. The SE are going to expect much more from you in that regard. Now, with many new strategies and new compliance initiatives, I think it's fair to say that having a clear communication strategy, one that allows you to act quickly to reduce the anticipated harm caused by any disruption, is absolutely critical. I think we probably would all agree with that. Now, this should include not just internal communication, but also how you seek to communicate externally, and therefore considering the needs of your customers, particularly where you may have customers with particular vulnerabilities, where that's relevant to your business, of course. And you should include how you provide those important bits of information, those warnings or those advice in terms of what's going on to consumers or any other stakeholders quickly. So particularly where there may be no sort of clear direct line of communication. So communication as part of your plan is king. Now, all of this, everything that you're putting into place, and all the key steps we've just considered here, need to be recorded within your self-assessment document. This self-assessment document is going to have to evidence the process and the rationale for the steps you've taken to meet your operational resilience requirements. Now, it should be made available to the regulator on request, but you don't have to send it to them otherwise. It's not something that has to be submitted to the SE unless they ask for it. Your board or the firm's management body, however you're structured, needs to approve the self-assessment document And they need to be able to, or as a business, you need to be able to ensure that you can evidence that's been effective challenge in terms of the methodology you've applied and the rationale that you've applied. It's particularly important when, or in respect to identifying your important business services and setting those tolerance levels in particular. This self-assessment document is a live document. It needs to be regularly reviewed and updated, where, for example, maybe you've got material changes to your business would be one reason why you'd want to review and update it, or maybe there's been changes, in fact, to the market and you're operating. But in any case, you need to be looking at this at least on an annual basis, and again, putting it back through that approval process. Now, I spoke earlier about lessons learned, and a crucial part of building your operational resilience is to learn from past events, whether those events are something that happens just from an internal perspective or more from an external environment perspective. How well your business did in terms of response is really important. If we take the pandemic, for example, I know of firms who, most firms, if I'm honest, responded really well, hit the ground running and were ready to go. But I also know a couple of firms that really struggled. Suddenly, their procurement team were out there looking for 3,000 laptops that they didn't have to allow people to work from home. So I think it's important to consider just how well you can respond to certain events. And if you look at your response to pandemic as an example, just think about, well, if mistakes were made, if you weren't quite ready, then sort of look further into the reasons for that, dig deep in terms of what went wrong. What could you put in place that would make sure that you don't repeat those mistakes in the future? You then need to look at adapting your systems and your processes, or even your people, for that matter, in regard to responding to any specific failings that could effectively or impact an effective operational resilience environment. And just remembering what I said further or earlier on in the webinar, it's all about your firm's ability to prevent, adapt, respond, and recover. All that said, I'm going to be totally forgiving to anyone who's thinking, right, okay, Lorraine, this is really just business continuity and some other guys. It's exactly the same thing. Well, I'm going to argue that I think it's not. They're similar. I would agree, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But it's much more than that. I think that operational resilience actually elevates business continuity through the application of much more plausible events. Of course, business continuity and operational resilience, similar concepts. They both focus on disruption, response, and recovery, and they also both involve testing and communication plans. However, my opinion, they're not synonymous. Having a business continuity plan in place doesn't mean you're going to be operationally resilient. Although, if I was being honest, I would maybe argue that having a robust operational resilience plan in place is maybe more likely to mean that you've got a decent business continuity in place as well. Where, for example, business continuity focuses on restoring activities during a disruption, operational resilience really involves a firm's ability to function, adapt, and absorb issues without significant damage during and after a disruption. Now, if we play that out in a real life scenario for me, just to bring it to life a wee bit for you. So let's imagine you've got an Amazon delivery driver and he's broken down. He's got everybody's Christmas packages on board. What a disaster. And it's the last delivery day before Christmas. If we look at that through the lens of a business continuity plan, what that will do is describe the response team, who the driver should escalate the matter to, the roles of each member and what roles they'll play, the resolution of maybe sending another truck, and the instant reporting on what happened when it all ends. But if we look at that through now the lens of operational resilience, what that does, that actually is going to consider this risk before it's happened, during the time it's happening, and in much more detail after it's happened. So operational resilience has already identified the scenario that impacts that important business service. So it's asking a question like, so what happens if a truck breaks down? What happens if we've got no more spare trucks? What happens if we've got no more spare drivers? What else could impact our delivery operations? And how can we ensure that the deliveries are made in such a scenario? At what point would this disruption cause intolerable harm to our customers and to our businesses? And where are our vulnerabilities and where are our weaknesses? So as you can see, they're quite similar, but also, excuse me, very different. Now, I said earlier that I was going to talk about third parties, and I think it's super important for firms to think about this, whether you engage third parties or whether in fact you are a third party, you have to consider this concept. Like many regulatory obligations, the ability of your firm to comply depends on having the right outsourcing in place. But before that, we actually need to look at governance and how your firm is governed. So you need to have defined roles and responsibilities. You should have effective MI in reporting. You need to have clear organisational direction and coordination across business functions. And it's likely, therefore, to lead to better resilience outcomes for your firm. This idea of effective governance, and particularly governance around your third parties, is reinforced by the regulators, and they expect that the board and senior management are super clear in terms of areas of accountability and ensuring that everyone involved has the required knowledge and understanding to manage and oversee your firm's operational requirement. Now, this means that your senior managers really need to be prepared to challenge your firm's operational resilience arrangements and steer the business culture towards one of resilience, providing the board with meaningful MI and data on the outcome. So apart from considering the impact of your third parties, you need to make sure that your governance considers appropriate committees, reporting lines, etc. The roles and responsibilities, are they clearly defined? Because that's often something that for sure is clearer to firms that are captured by the senior management certification regime. Something that definitely seems to be in the pipeline for payment services firms, incidentally, if you're one of those firms. But also focus on people and culture. Who are your operational champions? Who's going to be driving this forward in your business? And look to identify that common purpose and consistent communication. Really important, again, in respect to your third parties. Risk management, think about that. Are your risk appetite statements and your frameworks going to support your business in driving resilience? And just to reiterate, again, just in terms of accountability, it's your board or your senior management functions that remain responsible for your operational resilience environment, and they should be approving and identifying your firm's important business services, impact tolerances, and ultimately signing off your self-assessment document. And as we've mentioned previously, these need to be reviewed ongoing. So effective governance, including third-party oversight, cannot be achieved in a vacuum, and everyone in your business really has a role to play in supporting the operational resilience outcomes. And just one final word on that, I think that really needs to also include staff training, because your staff are going to play a very important role in helping you meet your operational resilience requirements. Just talking more fully now about the third parties, because a lot of clients rely on third parties, or in fact are those third parties that provide those important products and services. And that means that the resilience of their business is generally intertwined with the resilience of a third party. So as a result of that potential kind of, ripple effect, you'll also need to have robust contingency plans to manage the risks associated with the disruptions to your third-party services and any third parties that maybe those third parties even rely on. So you're going to have to think about and understand the potential vulnerabilities associated with your reliance on third parties. And you can do that by mapping out where these occur and understanding, again, just looking at that governance and responsibility piece, where do each of your responsibilities lie? Is it with that third party or is it beyond? And then set the appropriate tolerance levels accordingly. In doing so, you should consider a review of any changes in the risk profiles of the existing third parties used in those critical business processes, as well as keeping a sharp eye on where new third parties may be emerging. including those that provide those essential services, particularly in a remote working environment, which is the sort of new normal now. You should also take time to review incidents and failures that are attributable to any under or non-performance of your third parties. Any changes in their risk profile at all will ultimately change your risk profile as a firm, and needs therefore to be fully understood across the business so you can understand the resiliency of all parties involved. So as a business, you need to understand how quickly you'll be able to replace a key service provider. So these third parties, if for any reason they can no longer fulfill their obligations to your firm. But ultimately, the requirement to set and remain within impact tolerances is the responsibility of your firm, not necessarily of the third party. But caveat to that is that a lot of third parties will have their own responsibilities as well, depending on what type of firm they are. So it's an important point to think on, because this also may include sort of intra-group outsourcing agreements that a lot of firms have. So maybe where you've got sort of cross-border outsourcing by a parent to a sibling company, as an example. So third-party outsourcing is a key consideration as part of your journey. So let's assume that you've done everything you need to do, you've got everything in place, you think your operational resilience arrangements and framework is tip-top, and you have your self-assessment and scenario testing all done. So you might want to be thinking about, well, how can we expect the FCA to be assessing this? What are they actually going to be looking for if they do assess us? Now, it's likely that the FCA are actually going to assess firms' operational resilience capabilities against their own operational resilience framework. And that defines their view of industry best practices aligned to their existing rules and expectations on regulated firms. My opinion, and in truth, I think the regulator is likely to be more concerned with how you build resistance or resilience, but be more interested in whether your firm can actually meet the requirements to remain within those tolerance levels that you've set. And that is the purpose of the period from now until that date in March 2025, which might seem like a long time to wait, by the way, but it's going to come around quite quickly. And it's by that time by which your firm will have to provide assurance to the regulator if they ask, you can indeed meet those requirements. Therefore, you should use the time between now and then to address the vulnerabilities in your business model and build those capabilities. The FCA expects firms to embed operational resilience into business as usual. Now, in thinking about that, actually, there's a terminology used in the General Data Protection Regulation or Data Protection Regulation Compliance, which you may be familiar with, which is called by design and by default. And I think firms would be wise to apply the same concept and logic to operational resilience. So what I mean by that is, when you're designing products or services to be resilient, do it from the beginning. It's easier to do it that way than to try and reverse engineer it. So I guess in terms of the FCA, what you should expect the FCA to challenge you where the testing scenarios are not sufficiently plausible. And I expect that that's going to be a common area for supervisory discussion. I think supervisors will ask how firms have selected their scenarios and why. And I guess, best practice certainly is going to develop over time, but I think you therefore need to just take time to make sure that your scenarios and the tolerances you set are as robust as they possibly can be. Now, in terms of some final thoughts, I just want to leave you with some key areas to think of as part of this. Mentioned governance, particularly third-party oversight and governance, is such an important part of the operational resilience process, as it is for any other regulatory initiative. So involve and gain buy-in across the business. That could be IT, finance, compliance, even HR from a people perspective, operations as well. And again, don't forget to include your third parties. I think by accepting the task of building resilience and recognising any cost, and there's bound to be cost, let's be realistic. So any cost implication that there may be, I think you just need to offset that against and measure against what would the consequences be of non-compliance here. understand the elephant, that the elephant in the room may not actually be your biggest cause of harm. I think it's very easy, and from my experience, I've seen firms sort of focusing on these big ticket items, maybe like cybersecurity, which is super important, don't get me wrong, but then they sort of ignore the smaller items, you know, like change management, for example, which in themselves can also have a major impact and cause disruption where they go wrong. Think about the key decisions around implementation, consider how those decisions impact the firm's ability to recover from an event so that consumers are not harmed in the end. Just remember that operational resilience is absolutely not a one and done and should not be considered a point in time exercise. It is a team sport. And I think that you should therefore treat it as such and actively encourage people to get involved. I think that operational resilience, in my opinion, the way that if you're applying it properly, should actively discourage silos and enforce people to work together. So this means that all teams should know how to activate your recovery plans and work together on that, not knowing just how to communicate it to their teams, but also how their teams are expected to react as a result, and how they should work with others when restoring operations. So generally, just think about this as a bit of a business enabler. It's about consistency, it's about timely resolution, it's about continuous improvement. And if you do that well, what you're really going to build for yourself is a stable business, which is good. And surely the result of that has got to be some positive branding. That's the end of my presentation. I want to just now pass you back, if I may, to Jonathan, who will pick it up from here. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm sure our audience would agree that detailed session was invaluable. So that now concludes the formal presentation section of the webinar. I would now like to open up to our audience to see if we have any questions for our panelists. We've had a couple come in. But whilst we wait to see if any more come in, I'm going to be launching another quick poll for our audience to answer. So if you bear with me 2 seconds, I'm going to launch this now. You should see it on your screens. Would you find operational resilience support useful? Yes or no answers. We'll give it a few moments for people to respond, and then we will dive into the questions. So give it a moment or two more. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll here. And we can share the results actually to see. And actually, the majority of people have said, yes, they would find this quite useful. So I think this really goes back to a lot of things that Lorraine has said so far and what we've seen in the market, that firms have found this quite difficult to do so far. Lorraine, anything further on that?
No, I think it's interesting to see that, you know, firms would appreciate the support. And I think it's one thing sort of reading the requirements that the FCA have put down, but I think it's another thing benefiting from sort of best practice and some of the experiences that I guess that we've seen from other firms, which I think is absolutely invaluable.
Perfect. Well, we're getting some good questions coming through, but before I dive into them, I want to let everyone on here know that Thistle Initiatives can assist firms with operational resilience requirements. Our team can support you with implementation support and guidance, including the provision of self-assessment templates and an operational resilience policy and procedure. For firms that have already started on the journey, we can provide a review of their self-assessment approach and methodology. Our contact details are going to be on screen in a moment. And if you'd like to have a free consultation on operational resilience, please either give Lorraine or myself a call or an email and we can book it in. So now let's move on to the questions. If you can bear with me 2 seconds, I'm just going to get them up in front. So question number 1, do we need to consider all business areas when identifying important business services?
Okay, this is actually something we touched on near the start of the webinar. I'm sorry if you may have missed that, although I just touched on it briefly, so it is still a relevant question. I think whilst all business functions need to be involved, not every business process necessarily needs to be considered. Now, for me, it's kind of difficult to determine exactly what services are not important business services for your business without knowing the specific context of your business and the needs of your business, of course. However, I think it's fair to say that there are some services that are often considered less critical for businesses, including those non-essential sort of administrative tasks and certain internal processes that have, I guess, anything that's got a limited impact on customers or the external sort of stakeholders. So maybe a good example of that would be your payroll processes. I think they wouldn't need to be considered as an important business process because they're really not going to have a direct impact on your clients or your third parties. I think ultimately what I would say is the importance of a service for operational resilience will really depend, as I say, on that specific objectives and priorities of your business. And I think that's why it's super important at the very start to take time to understand where your important business services sit. But generally, these administrative functions, no. Hope that
Thank you very
answers.
much.
No worries.
Question number 2. You mentioned that desk-based testing won't be enough. How best should we carry out scenario testing?
Okay, so yeah, I did see that. But when I said desk-based testing wouldn't be enough, I think it still has its advantages, but I think it needs to be used in conjunction with live testing. So desk-based testing really would involve replicating scenarios through maybe, for example, computer simulations or paper-based exercises. But on its own, it just may not be enough. So what you could do to complement that is use real world or live scenario testing. So what that looks like is where you would maybe actually implement response plans in a real world condition just to test their effectiveness. I think that these live scenario testing examples can provide, I think it provides a much more accurate assessment of your operational resilience, and I think it allows you to better evaluate your systems and processes in that real world. And I think that, to be fair though, I think that type of testing maybe is more complex, certainly going to be more resource intensive than desk-based scenario testing, but I definitely think it can provide much more valuable insight into exactly how you respond in the event of a real life crisis. So I think when you're looking to do that, I think make sure the exercises involve, you know, a range of stakeholders, just to make sure that you're covering all perspectives and that all inputs are considered. So a balance of both, but definitely just don't focus on a desk-based one on itself. I think it won't give you enough data.
Perfect. Number 3, does the FCA expect firms to present the self-assessment document in a particular way?
Okay, that's a good question. I've been asked that many a times. So the FCA hasn't actually prescribed how the self-assessment document itself needs to be presented, so in terms of like layout or you know what application you use to present that. But certainly in terms of content, there's some expectations there. So it needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, and it needs to be comprehensive. It should clearly outline your approach to operational resilience. It should include things like your risk management processes, your response plans, your systems for monitoring and reporting risks and disruptions. And I think generally it just needs to be well organized and easy to understand, but also it needs to be supported by good data and evidence. You need to evidence and give the rationale behind certain measures or certain, you know, for example, you've identified important business services. What's the rationale for understanding that is or is not an important business service? The document should also be regularly reviewed and updated to ensure that it remains accurate and relevant. So however you display it, up to you, but it's just got to include all those good things.
Thank you. And number 4, how do we measure the effectiveness of operational resilience?
Also a really good question, actually. And I think how firms measure many things is always a question I get asked. I think measuring effectiveness of operational resilience, first of all, I think it's super important, because how else are you going to understand how well your firm's doing against these requirements? And you know, also conversely, how are you going to identify where things aren't going so well and you've got areas to improve? So how might you do that? Excuse me, an easy way forward is to develop metrics and KPIs. Simple KPIs off the top of my head might be things like time to recover from a disruption, the number of disruptions you've experienced, and maybe the impact those disruptions have had on customers and stakeholders. The scenario testing that I've just mentioned, both desktop and live, is going to give you some meaningful data. The output of that will certainly that you can use to measure. I think also where you have an incident management plan, which allows you to track and respond to incidents, will also give you meaningful data and MI that's going to help you identify what you're doing good, so keep doing it, and where you're not doing things so well. I think that also links very much to the sort of lessons learned aspect that we discussed. Also, don't forget about feedback from your key stakeholders, you know, that whether that's your employees, whether that's your customers, whether that's third parties, just get some feedback on how well they've seen things working, and use that feedback to identify again areas for improvement. But I think generally just that continuous review of the firm's processes and systems and making improvements where necessary, sort of based on the results of scenario testing, incident management and feedback, is just going to help you build up a picture of how well you're doing. So it will depend on each firm. Is going to look a little bit different, of course, but in a nutshell, that's how I would seek to approach it. Hope that answers the question.
Certainly does. The next one's a question I can answer is, are the slides going to be provided at the end of the session? We don't send out the slides, but we will be putting the recording of the session online, and everyone will receive a link to the recording once it is live. Lorraine, another one for you now. We are a third party with no direct impact on the end customer. Do we still need to consider business services and impact tolerances relating to customers as part of our operational resilience plan?
Okay, this is also a really good question, and also a question I get very often from a third party, because they can't really see necessarily immediately where they fit in. So to answer your question, yes, it's still important to consider business services and impact tolerances relating to customers as part of your operational resilience plan, even if you're a third party with no direct impact on that end customer. And this is because, and by the way, just caveat to that, this will depend on the type of third party you are and what services you're providing, but generally, it's very likely that the service you're providing, if you have disruptions to your operations, they could indirectly have an effect on the end customer, sort of affecting the services they receive from that primary service provider, I guess. So I think having a robust operational resilience plan in place at a third party end is only going to help ensure that your operations are super resilient, and possible potential disruptions can be then minimized where they may have an impact on the end customer. And certainly if I were a client who used third parties as such, I absolutely would need to be considering what they're doing around operational resilience. I think, you know, if you think about how it might impact, it could, if you're a third party, you could impact that primary service providers' interdependency in terms of their services. It could, you know, cause them reputational damage, and, you know, they really could be super reliant on the services you're providing. Therefore, any disruption to your operations is going to impact their operations and ultimately what they deliver. So it's all very much intertwined, I think.
Perfect. Next one. Hi, will the FCA use security penetration tests or to check operational resilience?
I think that's really penetration testing. I think definitely has to be part of your resilience plan. I think it's part of the means by which you will test your resilience, maybe to focus on such things as penetration testing. I don't think that the FCA, in my opinion, will go to the level of checking what the output from your penetration testing is in terms of your operational resilience per se. I mean, they look at that for other reasons and other regulatory returns, for example. But as part of operational resilience, I think that what you're really needing to do is to understand what those controls are in place and what would impact your tolerance levels. So it will definitely play its part, but not necessarily something the FCA is going to immediately hone in on as part of that.
Thank you very much. I'm just giving it a moment to see if we have any further questions coming in. bear with me 2 seconds. Give people. All right, we've got let's just go for this one here. Could you please give a few recent examples that you have had to deal with regarding operational resilience for a client in relation to the FCA?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know exactly what there's a lot to say about that, so I don't know exactly what point of that question you want me to focus on. So so where I'm dealing with a client or working on behalf of a client, and where it's worked well in the past, I have actually become part of that project management group. So that implementation project management group. Where I've helped firms is very often with the tricky job of identifying the important business services, because it's trickier than you think. I think sometimes I think it's very easy to become blinkered by your business processes and forget how to split them up into individual processes or individual services. Firms tend to kind of bulk them together. So I think having a fresh set of eyes through someone like myself who can guide and who can look at that with that unblinkered view and start peeling that back a little bit. So certainly helped with that. I've certainly helped in terms of helping set the impact tolerances and also discussing whether in fact they have been reasonable. Are they reasonable? Do they look right? You know, are you thinking about the right types of measures, etc., etc. Also building out the actual self-assessment testing template itself, making sure that that's there and that has all the relevant component parts, and working with the business to identify, set up, and in fact test initially the scenario testing and all the way through to lessons learned. So pretty much I can support you, or we can support you with as little or as much as you need. Some clients require us to be a big part of that project and have us there in the background or fully engaged with everything that's going on. Other clients just need us to maybe, for example, write them an operational resilience policy, which is a good part of that, or maybe just look at their governance arrangements. It depends on your need. But generally, my experience, my opinion, where it works well is I'm pretty much part of your project management team, and I'm stepping through it with you as almost like an independent challenge to everything that you're doing. So I don't know if that's answered your question, if that's what you were going with that, but please feel free to bounce it back to us. I'm sure Jonathan will put together some Q&A after this anyway, for any questions that we may not get to.
Thank you very much. And we've had one more question come in, but I think it's quite specific. So we'll contact that individual personally to see if we can answer it in relation to their business. Also very conscious of time today. So I would like to thank all attendees on today's webinar for joining us for this interesting discussion. And Lorraine, thank you very much for your time in presenting it.
You're welcome.
As discussed, this webinar has been recorded and we'll be putting the recording online soon. Please follow Thistle Initiatives on LinkedIn to see when it becomes available to watch. Thank you very much and have a great day.